And welcome back to the Illuminations Media Network. I'm Tamara Westwood, your host, and I'm glad you could join us once again today. Today we have a guest, Jerry Marzinsky. He's been on the show before, and he spoke about interesting beliefs and some truths that we may not understand about what we call mental illness. Waiting for our guest to come. I'm going to share a paper I wrote in college as I was pursuing my psych degree. And the debate was all about the true cause of depression and thus other mental illnesses or mental disorders, according to the DSM-5. Now, for me, I stood the ground that depression and other mental difficulties and challenges, behaviors that get in the way of living a functional life, an optimal life, behaviors that can harm others and ourselves. I spoke to that as part of a natural part of the human experience, and specifically depression. And I spoke to the fact that depression, according to Hickey, 2009, is a very common and natural part of being human. You know, that we have to also pay attention to the fact that the medical diagnosis of depression is relatively recent. It comes with many, many problems. We also have to examine the impact the physical environment can have on the individual, nutrition, early trauma, and how all of those factors can play in to any kind of a mental dysfunction or disorder in an individual. Now, certainly to speak to that natural mechanism that the body uses to reset itself after prolonged trauma. You know, if someone is on red alert for so very long because of a trauma or because of some awful thing that's occurred, or even due to our negative thinking, where we're inflicting microaggressions upon ourselves over and over and over again, the weight of this, you know, can be overwhelming. And the body, the mind just has to reset so that everything shuts down. And of course, we're not going to enjoy the things that we used to enjoy. Of course, we're going to have low energy, and we're going to just basically want to retreat. And in that allows the person to regroup and recalibrate the nervous system and hopefully get some help in shifting the thought process, letting go of the ruminating of negative thoughts, letting go of attachment to painful ideas, of old belief systems that might be adding to the confusion and the doubt, low self-esteem issues. Also in my paper, I spoke about the role of pharmaceuticals in supporting this, in supporting the healing process, that is. That certainly sometimes people are so low that they've gotten to a point where they just can't come out of that hole. And that an artificial means through pharmaceuticals or even through herbal supplements can help them to get back to that square one so that they can remember what it's like to be human. But not to depend on that, knowing that that is just something that's used temporarily to pull the person to that place. The most beneficial treatment is to have cognitive therapy, hypnotherapy, any other type of positive psychotherapy to help the person during that time. You know, whether you're going to be using pharmaceuticals or not, the shifting in the perspective, the shifting of the thought process is what's super key here. Also, in my paper, I spoke to the idea that there's a chemical imbalance. Now, there hasn't been any evidence of that. There's no evidence, there's no study that's backing that statement. But we do know that our thoughts our feelings, our beliefs do change the chemistry of our brains, and thus do change the way that we feel and the way that we respond in the world. So the brain chemistry that can show up is a result of the depressant, not the other way around. And that is what I found in my research, that is where the depression is coming from. That is where the whole idea of chemical imbalance comes from. That it comes from the environmental influences, the person's belief systems, the thoughts, the ideas that lead to that over a prolonged period of time. I also highlighted some research that, let's see, it was according to, it's a super long list, and I respect and honor those who did the study, but I'm just going to say that it's in the Bio Sci Med Science magazine, and it's 2007 February. To quote their findings here, it says that the perception that one's basic needs are not being met predicates the future depressive symptoms. Now, this is something that they found, that when somebody believes that they're not going to get their needs met, they can go into a depressive state because, of course, they're worried, they're concerned, they're anxious about not getting their basic needs. And you might say, well, what are those basic needs? Well, certainly from Hickey's approach, Hickey speaks of those basic needs being basically 8 basic physical needs. And these are the needs that take care of the physicality. Some of them are also emotional components. And these are all requirements for our homeostasis. So the first one is good nutrition. The second one is fresh air, sunshine, physical activity, purposeful activity with regular experiences of success, good relationships, adequate and regular sleep, and a sense of control in our lives. The ability to avoid destructive social entanglements while remaining receptive to positive encounters. So all of those break it on down, that when we're not getting our needs met, all kinds of stuff can go awry. Maybe we will resort to defense mechanisms where we are harming other people or ourselves in order to get some attention to what we need. You know, perhaps we're shutting down simply because we're at the point where we're saying, what's the use? So basically, that's what my paper spoke to. The fact of perception. How am I perceiving the world? And what kind of world do I live in? Is it a dangerous place for me? Am I not going to get my basic needs met? Are the people around me antagonistic? Am I antagonistic towards myself? All of that over a prolonged period of time, it would stand to reason that pretty soon, when that psychology starts to shut down about what it means to be the self in the world, that the physicality is going to be able to shut down too. And you may want to curl up in a ball and just give up. But it is a very natural mechanism that we all have there that helps us to reboot and reset. As with anything, we don't want to hang out there too long. Because when we hang out there, it might be hard to crawl out of that hole. And so that's my perspective on depression. And there may be some other ways of looking at other mental illness, you know, according to what those needs are. What needs are not being met within the individual? I'm hoping that that did help. That was certainly my 2 cents. Um, I did a lot of research to try and understand that, and certainly that's because of my personal experiences. My mother had a psychological disorder, and it affected her life in a very negative way. But the good thing about it is that it raised my awareness. You know, as a child, watching her pain and her suffering in that area of her life, and so now I get to research it and understand it to help other people avoid that situation if at all possible, and to shed light on how to avoid it or how to get out of it if you're in it. Show. We have Jerry Marzinsky back on the show. Oh, I know you remember those voices. Last time you were on the show, Jerry, we dug into those deep aspects of what's really going on in the mind. You know, when there are these intrusive thoughts that are coming in that sound like us, but as we now know, they are not us. They are just hitchhiking a ride. Well, Jerry, welcome back. And I understand that you just got back from Egypt. You're still dealing with jet lag, huh?
Yeah, I'll get over it.
Well, today in our show, we're going to be speaking about the myth. This is a myth buster show. We're talking about that whole idea that depression and probably other mental illnesses are caused by a chemical imbalance that is purely biological. Now, Jerry is here to wake you up. Jerry, let's go into the history about where that whole idea came from.
Well, let's go back at the start, back in the early 1800s. You know, they didn't have anything to control psychiatric patients except chains and straitjackets, and that took a lot of fighting. I know most of you guys out there have never tried to stuff a psychiatric patient into a straitjacket, but it's not an easy job, and people get hurt on both sides, both staff and inmates. Yeah. They were still using those suckers when I was working in the state hospital. So they didn't know what to do with these people back then. So they would chain them up. At the state hospital I worked in, Milledgeville, they treated them very kindly, and they found that if they treated them kindly, they responded better. But their methods of treatment, you know, this is before drugs really came on the scene as we know them today. They started off with something they called puking with the schizophrenics. So what they're trying to do is get these people under control as best they could. So what they do is give them an emetic to make them sick, and then they'd throw up. And you know how you feel after you throw up. You don't want to.
You're exhausted. Yeah.
You're like, oh man, you know. So, you know, that was one method of control. Then they tried hot and cold showers. You know, they for the females, they gave them Epsom salt douches and apple cider and grapefruit juice douches. This is the early pioneers of psychiatry here. And then, you know, in Europe, they started with psychoanalysis. Found it didn't work very well with schizophrenics. And the psychoanalyst said something like, the schizophrenics are very adept at antagonizing and disagreeing with the therapist. It's like there's a psychoanalyst trying to psychoanalyze a schizophrenic, and they said that their disagreeing with the therapist interfered with the progress in their talk therapies. So, you know, didn't work real well with insane guys.
I bet. I could see Freud, right?
Yep, trying to talk to a schizophrenic. You know, then they moved on to lobotomies with the more violent ones. So what they would do is get virtually an ice pick or something and stick it through the corner of their eye and scramble their prefrontal cortex. I mean, just destroy their whole prefrontal cortex. And of course, that turned them into a semi-vegetable. At the time I got to the state hospital, I only had met one because they had stopped doing that decades before. And my initial impression after talking to the guy was he just wasn't quite human.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how to put my finger on it, but nor was he violent or out of control.
He was well behaved.
He was well behaved, but he had half his brain missing, and he like I said, he just wasn't quite human. He was not productive. He couldn't do anything. He couldn't, other than maybe feed himself and live in the state hospital.
That happened to one of the Kennedy children, one of the daughters, didn't it? Seems like I remember reading something like that. Yeah.
I'm surprised because they stopped doing that a long time ago,
Mm-hmm.
but no telling.
Yeah. Hmm.
So then they moved on to something called ETC, or electroshock therapy.
Mm-hmm.
I watched one of these things. Yeah. Back in I think it was the 30s, the state hospital I was working in had 13,000 patients, and they would administer 3,000 of these shock treatments a year.
So these are bolts of electricity that were forced through a person's nervous system.
Let me take you there. So I got a call from a psych friend of mine in another psychiatric unit. He phone rang. He said, hey man, Dr. X is doing a demonstration of this shock treatment over here in about a half an hour. And come on, get over here. You get to see it. I never saw one before. I just read about them. Mm-hmm. So he met me at the door, and we walked back, and here was this big room with pillars in the middle. And here's this Cuban psychiatrist lecturing a number of patients around this table. And here was this box, a wooden box with knobs and dials on it. And he was talking, and he picked up these two electrodes that were about this big, metal electrodes with wires hanging on them. He said, these are the shock pads where the electricity runs through. And then he smeared gel on them, and he said, if we didn't smear the gel, then the electricity would burn the patient's head. That's how powerful it was. So then he called to the nurse, and here's a bunch of students around this gurney. Called the nurse and said, bring in the patient. So here they have this little scrawny female, like old, barely walking. Here's two nurses dragging her to the gurney. And then they strapped her down, 4-pointer, and then across her chest, and then across her head. And I'm looking at them, man, what are they doing? They're really fixing her to that table. And then the psychiatrist gets out this horse needle about this big, and he sticks it in this white solution. He sucks it in, and it's like milk color. And, I'm looking at it, and I asked him, I said, that's the biggest needle I've ever seen. That's a horse needle. What are you going to do with that?
Goodness.
He says, well, that's muscle relaxer. If we didn't give that to the patient, her bones would snap when we gave her the electroshock.
Convulsions. Oh.
So they stuck it in her, and I'm watching this, and instead of just pushing it in her, they sucked blood out of her and mixed the blood and the stuff together, and I'm sitting there going, oh. And then they jammed the whole needle in her.
Oh.
And then he hooks up these electrodes, and he tells everybody to get back. And he goes, okay, ready. And then he hits this button, and this poor lady just starts flopping all over the table. This
is a little tiny elderly woman.
Elderly lady. And I'm like shocked, just absolutely shocked. And while she's doing this, he's still flapping to all these students, talking to all these students. And then I'm going, when's he going to shut the damn thing off? And finally he does. And he's still talking to the students, not paying attention to the patient. And she's turning cyanotic. She's turning blue on the table. And I'm like horrified. And I said, doctor, she's dying. She's cyanotic, And he goes, oh, like an afterthought. And then he gets the heart thing, the EEG thing, and gives her a shock on the chest, and she jumps again. And, she wet her pants, and she was sweating and just laying there. And, then her heart stops and her color came back, and I'm just overwhelmed with what I saw.
The cruelty.
I started walking away and I almost fainted. And I'm not weak stomached, you know. I hung on to a pillar, you know, kind of trying to get because I was about ready to go down after that. And that's 3,000 of those a year.
Oh my.
So that was before they had any significant kind of drug. Now they also used that for punishment as much as they did treatment, and the people who ordered it were not the doctors but the attendants. They go, hey, Johnny's causing me a lot of trouble these days, man. I think he needs to be a shock treatment. He looks depressed and he's agitated. And bam, you know, they were the guys who determined who got the shock treatment.
Oh.
So, and it was like a production line. I mean, 3,000 a year, they just lined them up and hit them up. So then they started moving into some of the drugs, and they started with insulin shock.
Okay.
So the shock treatments did work for a while. I mean, it surprised me that the psychotic voices left for a short period of time after being shocked like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I read later there was a therapist who was actually using static electricity to drive the voices out of the patients, and it worked temporarily. Mm-hmm. So those shock treatments dumbed them down. And they were like stunned for a couple of weeks after that, and they weren't causing any problems. So here's their treatment.
Right, about control.
About control. And then they moved into insulin shock, and this is the coming of chemicals. Mm-hmm. And what they basically did there is overdose the patient with insulin, burned all the sugar out of his body, and put him into shock. So, you know, it kind of controlled the symptoms for a little while, but only temporarily. And then they do it again. So,
wow.
And then they're kind of like, okay, what causes this schizophrenic symptoms? So psychiatrists started out, you know, looking for somebody to blame, and they first blamed the mother. Well, it's the mother. She didn't feed him right, or she didn't give him the right nutrition, or she did this or did that. Put it all on the mother's back. Mm-hmm. You know, she ate the wrong foods during pregnancy, or she did something to cause this. Or, I mean, imagine all the guilt that instilled in mothers that had schizophrenia.
Sure.
And there's no evidence for that. None. It's just they just dreamt this up and went, oh, well, it's the mother's fault. So when they found out it wasn't the mother's fault, you know, then they moved on to it's a genetic disorder. It's the genes. You know, they didn't find any evidence for that either.
Right. So it's the genes, right? There's nothing that you can do about it.
There's nothing you can do about it except take their expensive, destructive medications.
Right.
So then they moved into the era of what would be considered, you know, modern drugs. Now the drug companies are out there telling you, oh yeah, we spend millions and billions of dollars on drug research, and you know, that's why we have to ramp up the cost of these drugs to astronomical levels. Mm-hmm. Well, none of the initial drugs for psychosis were found in any kind of research. They were found in dye chemistry labs, dyeing clothing.
What? Yes,
and the people who were working in those dye chemistry labs found that the dyes that they were using had this sedative effect and would dumb down the workers. So this changed the story there. So one guy learned about this, and you know, he every major class of drugs that psychiatry started using were found by accident around the 1950s in fabric dye research labs. So what one of these guys did was kind of extracted whatever it was that was dumbing these people down, and went to one of the psych hospitals and said, hey, why don't you try this stuff? You know, it might be a lot easier than stuffing these guys in straitjackets. There was no research involved with this to start with. all that stuff about, oh yeah, there's heavy research. We got billions of dollars in research. This was discovered by accident. Every single major class of psychiatric drugs were started and discovered in dye factories. So the hospitals, the state hospitals, found that, this was a great way to manage populations. You just drug these suckers up, and then the drug companies got hold of this, and they extracted the active ingredients from these dyes, and they started selling these things. So they would dumb down the entire population, and they never told these people, as far as I saw, the destructive effects of these drugs.
This calls to mind this new series. I believe it's Amazon or is it Netflix? But with Julia called Homecoming. Yeah, I believe it's Homecoming. It's very interesting. If you haven't seen it, you definitely want to check it out. It's speaking to this, but it's about soldiers that have come home from being deployed,
Mm-hmm.
and they're introducing these chemicals in foods to rewire them. I'm not going to spoil it for those of you who haven't seen it, but it's quite interesting.
I'll tell you, it wouldn't surprise me. So for the first 10 years, they started using these tranquilizers. What they were major tranquilizers.
Mm-hmm.
They had no idea how they worked. None. Zero. After 10 years, the chemical and the drug industry got hold of these things and started putting out the rumor that they cured some kind of chemical imbalance in the patient's brain.
So that's where it came from. That we induced this drug to sort out this chemical imbalance in the brain. Okay.
The problem is, even while I was at the state hospital, they were telling me that. And when I started there, I believed that also.
Mm-hmm.
After a while, I started watching the psychiatrist, and, I never saw them give any kind of drug test or lab work to determine what anything was out of balance in the patient's brain. Ever.
And how about to date? Any evidence of that?
There is nothing. They have no test to determine any chemical imbalance in the brain with regard to psychosis, depression, anxiety, nothing. Now they may say, oh yeah, MRI, but MRI only measures electrical activity and blood concentration, stuff like that in the brain. It has nothing to do with the chemicals or the chemical imbalance. They have no measure of any chemical imbalance in the brain. So
wow.
here they start like going, okay, well, the drug apparently works.
Right.
It looks like there may be an increase in serotonin, so they must balance some of the serotonin levels.
Right. So it's just the theory. In other words, it's just the theory. It's
made up garbage, So they have no idea of what the chemical imbalance of the brain is or should be. None.
Right.
They don't know how much serotonin should be in the brain. So they just go, oh, well, it's a drug and it works, so it must be balancing something. So they have this weak correlation between an increase in serotonin and these chemicals that they're using.
And a correlation doesn't mean correlation is not evidence.
No,
yeah,
not by a long
at
shot.
all.
No.
Yeah.
But they're selling $3.5 billion of these drugs, and they're drugging down entire prison and state hospital populations, not to mention the population in general. They're dumbing them down at a horrendous level with this bull crap they're saying. So
a question for you in this. I was speaking to brain chemistry. Now we know that when a person becomes depressed and they've been, in this state for a while, that it can change brain chemistry, or is that theory as well? That the fact that when someone is in a negative state, they've kind of checked out, out of life, so to speak, that the chemistry changes as a result of.
They have no proof of that. Now,
okay.
The electrical activity is probably suppressed.
Okay.
Because you're not feeling good. You ain't firing on all four cylinders, you know.
Right.
So, but they have no evidence to show that there's any kind of chemical imbalance that causes that.
Yeah, before or after the egg, which came first, right?
So back in 1910, the Carnegie Foundation and the Rockefellers got together, and they sponsored something called, it's the infamous Flexner report. So what this said is that, any medical school that is not teaching pharmacology-based medicine will be shut down and will not be licensed. So
Well, that's pretty gangster.
That's pretty gangster. Flexner report. So what happened is light therapy, chiropractic, Tesla's high-frequency violet ray, which you can buy today now, finally. But they outlawed it back then because it was curing a lot of people of a lot of different things, many more than the drugs that they were putting out. So Tesla spent $4,000, I think $4,000 or $40,000 of his own money to go to France and have this thing manufactured. And doctors all over the U.S. were using it at a high rate until the Carnegies and the Rockefellers said, hey, man, this is interfering with our drug sales. We want this outlawed. So they paid Congress to outlaw it. It was illegal to use it. It was illegal to manufacture it. And then the Depression hit, so it was forgotten about. But you can get it today. You look it up on the internet. It's a Tesla high-frequency violet ray. It cures a ton of stuff. Arthritis.
So Jerry, how does it work? I mean, certainly it's electrical, and certainly our body is an electrical system.
It's a very strange device. It's very interesting. It has a glass tube, and through that tube flows a purple plasma. And it looks like water flowing, but it's a purple electrical plasma.
Ozone.
Well, it creates ozone. So one of the things it does is that electrical charge, it's a very high voltage electrical charge with virtually no amperage. It's something like 50,000 volts with no amperage. And you put that on and you can feel your body just being charged up. So your cells are like little capacitors. And it charges up all the cells. It's great for rashes, mosquito bites. You get a mosquito bite, you hit it with that, and it stops itching in like 30 seconds. It's gone. Helps cuts that you have, helps them heal. So it increases the oxygen level in your cells because it goes in as, what do they call it? It goes into ozone and then breaks down as oxygen in your cells, in your bloodstream.
So it's antimicrobial properties for sure. Okay.
You can look it up on the internet. They have it's called the Tesla high frequency violet ray.
I remember that in cosmetology school we had that. It was a rake for regrowing hair.
Regrowing hair.
Glass tubes that you would put on the module.
That's it.
All of a sudden you would get this smell that to me sounded like bleach, but it smelled like ozone.
It was ozone.
Interesting.
So what they've been doing, they've been using that with racehorses, these expensive multi-million-dollar racehorses for years. They'll get a Tesla coil and bolt it onto their broken leg. They used to have to shoot those guys. Now they bolt that coil on there, and those legs are healed, and that thing's good to move. Do you think they'll announce that to the U.S. public, that they're using this? The veterinarians are using it on horses, but they won't allow them to use it on people.
Wow. Very interesting.
So, look it up. Research it for yourself. They're on the internet. Get a 30 water if you can get one. And it'll take cataracts out of your eyes, heal sores. I had carpal tunnel. It improved that like 85%. Doesn't work on everything. It works on an awful lot of things, more than I've ever seen before.
So, Jerry, how do you think it works on the biochemical level? I mean, electrons are affected by it, and things start to line up.
I don't have a good idea. I'm not, you'd have to ask Tesla that. All I understand is that it charges up your body. So you grab onto this thing and you hold on to it for a few minutes and you can feel your whole body charging up.
Wow.
Not supposed to let it on one spot for any more than a minute. You have to shut it down after 15 minutes to let it cool off.
Right.
It's a pretty cool thing. So they outlawed it. It was curing people for free without the use of toxic drugs. And
the world we live in, Jerry.
They made it illegal. So the only universities that survived this Flexner report were the big ones like McGill University and some of those. So if they weren't teaching pharmacology-based medicine, they didn't get a license.
So what you're speaking to is if they weren't teaching that medicine is the solution to everything, then they were cut out. All their funding was gone. They were shut down.
Cut out. They wouldn't get a license. They wouldn't license them.
Woo!
And any doctor who tried to say, hey, I know this violet ray works, or I know that naturopathy works, and they would take their license. They didn't want any interference with their money. Right.
I guess it's the same reason why we're still using fossil fuels.
Oh yeah, there are free energy devices out there, but everybody who's tried to produce one has either been killed or locked up. So it just went from there. It's like then the drug companies started saying, well, it's a chemical imbalance.
Yes.
They didn't have any proof. So the FDA was even backing this until one organization confronted them and said, what evidence do you have for this? It took them a year to answer that organization, and they said none. And what's so interesting right now, the FDA is on a military base, a guarded military base, which if you approach it, they have the permission to shoot you.
The FDA?
The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, is on a ex-military base that is guarded, and you cannot approach it. So it makes you wonder, what do they need all that security for?
Yeah.
So Jason went there, tried to visit that place, and was confronted by armed guards and told to leave.
Wow.
Not come back. So it's interesting. So
Jerry, looking at the history and looking at the false claims, as to the cause and the solution, from your experience, actually working with these psychiatric patients, what is at the root cause, of these mental disturbances? I mean, certainly as a hypnotherapist, I can say, a lot of them are as a result of the person's style of thinking, creates a lot of it. That also opens people up to, other things that are out there vibrating on a lower frequency, these entities that would hijack. What have you found?
I found that to be the truth.
Yeah.
So one thing I wanted to know throughout my education, starting with psychology, BA at Temple University, is like, where do thoughts come from?
Yeah.
That
was our topic last time. Where do they come from?
They don't address that. They don't even bring it up. It's not even, so I went through the 4 years of psychology undergrad, and they didn't mention it. 2 years of master's degree, they didn't mention it. So I'm thinking, well, they must be holding that information in the doctoral program. They only give it to doctors.
We're going to get to it, right?
So I'm like, okay, let's check it out. So I applied and somehow got into one of what was supposed to be the best doctoral programs in the country. And the stuff I saw was just nauseating. Teaching you how to lie with statistics, the egotistical battles between the professors, the moving around and beating on the, oh, it was just, you know, and I was starting to get fed up with it. So finally one day, the head of the department, who used to be a preacher, was giving a lecture on how to cheat with statistics. And, you know, I raised my hand. I said, wait a second, you're describing this segment, this top 5% of the population, as if it's a separate population from the entire population. And that ain't right. So what's going on here? And he looked at me and he goes, if they can't figure it out, it's their fault. And I'm like, man, it just blew my head.
So
it's
the
like,
populace is depending on experts, right?
I remember another time I was working as a teaching assistant, and I was running groups with master students, and the professor came in one day and he was going to watch, and I goes, oh, that's good. So at the end of the group, one of the students asked me a question. I didn't know the answer. And I said, well, you know, I don't know. Just straight up, I don't know. I don't know that. And after the group, that professor said, I want to see you in my office. I went down to his office, and I'm sitting there looking at him like, you know, what's the deal?
Right.
He looks at me and he goes, don't you ever tell a student you don't know an answer. And I'm like, what? You know, like, looking at this guy like, you've got to be kidding.
Don't you ever admit that you're human.
Admit that you don't know the answer.
Oh, that's bad.
Oh,
that's scary right there.
So, you know, I'm at the end of my rope. So after that lesson in how to lie with statistics, this professor, the head of the department, he says, does anybody have any questions? Yeah. So where did thoughts come from? And he just froze, and he looked at me like I had dropped out of a flying saucer at his feet and was speechless, and he just stared at me like he didn't know what to say. And I'm like, come on, you know. And he goes, you come and see me after class. I'm like, oh no, not again. You know, they didn't know. That's what I wanted to know, and they didn't know. So from then on, that program was useless as far as I was concerned. Probably would have done a lot better off if I hadn't spent 7 years working at the state hospital with real patients.
Yeah.
I'd see all these conflicts all the time. They, you know, what they were teaching me wasn't what was actually going on.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Did I tell you about the I'm Jesus Christ story the last time?
Yes. Yeah, and just in case someone listening did not catch the first episode, touch on that just a bit.
Well, yeah, back when I was in undergraduate school, they assigned us. I was in abnormal psychology. I love abnormal psychology. I don't know why, but I just took to it like a duck out of water.
Yeah, it's interesting.
They gave us a series of articles to read, and here's this one psychologist published an article saying that if two crazy people with the same delusion met each other, then one of them would have to give way and change to a different delusion.
Right.
And, you know, even back then I'm going, why would that have to happen? I mean, you got two crazy guys, they're both crazy, they had why would one of them change their delusion because another one had the same exact delusion? Mm-hmm. So I stored that away because we had no access to clinical populations. Right. Even I started working with prisoners in the master's degree, but in undergrad, you had to believe what they were telling you. And for somebody who doesn't trust authority, that was real hard for me. So I blocked that away. And then, maybe 15 years later, I was on the psych ward up in the state hospital, and a new patient showed up. And he's talking to himself out there, so I knew he was hearing voices. So I kind of walked up to him and I said, hey, you're new here. I hadn't seen you before. What's your name? And he looks at me and he goes, I'm Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. And I go, okay, here it comes. This is my chance. And I looked at him and I said, no, you're not Jesus Christ because I am. And I'm sitting there going, okay, all right, let's see what he does. Mm-hmm. So he looks all perplexed and he's looking at me like, thinks about it for a minute. And he goes, looks at me in the eye, and he goes, okay, we can both be Jesus Christ. And he walks away. And I'm like, okay, they fed me those lies. What other lies did they tell me? You know, so it's kind of like my distrust was just, you know, out of this world. Mm-hmm. So when I was at the state hospital, started working with schizophrenics, they were hearing what they call voices. And they never told us in school that these voices, you know, all they said is hallucinations. You know, oh yeah, they're hallucinating. They have auditory and visual hallucinations. Mm-hmm. What was that? You know, back then I'm reading a hallucination. So it's just, they have this crazy stuff and doesn't make any sense.
Right. No, where does a hallucination come from?
Well, thing is, it wasn't a hallucination, but I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I believed it was for years.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I'm seeing that these voices are consistently negative. They never tell them anything positive. It's always negative.
Right.
And I'm going, if it's a hallucination, which is random, mm-hmm. This is not one. Mm-hmm. And you would, and I thought, well, maybe, you know, they're hallucinating and this is word salad they're hearing. It's just a bunch of words, like, you know, the voices are talking to them but not making any sense. No, that wasn't the case. I mean, you creep up behind when you listen to what he's saying. He's carrying on half a conversation. It's a coherent conversation with something I can't see. Right. And he's reacting to whatever this is in that conversation, getting mad and arguing, and you know, that's a coherent conversation. They don't talk about that in school. So I started asking these guys, you know, what are the voices telling me? And they would get upset. You know, they didn't want to talk about the voices. There is no positive benefit for a schizophrenic to talk about his voices. It's always negative stuff happens. People abandon them. They, you know, hey, you're possessed. The family gets worried. They drag them off to the psychiatrist. The psychiatrist says you're nuts. You know, fills them full of drugs. They get locked up. There's nothing good happens.
Yeah, there's no intelligence lacking here. You know, they understand that this is something that I can't do if I want to live in society.
Well, or if I don't want to be drugged senseless or locked up.
Right.
Or lose all my friends or worry my family.
Right.
So, and the voices themselves, I didn't know this at the time, the voices themselves are telling them not to talk to anybody about it. And they're telling them, you know, you keep talking about it, you're going to get locked up. I didn't know it at the time. But yeah, there is no positive outcome for them to talk about their voices, especially to a psych. You know, the guys who locked them up in the first place. So it took me a couple of years to learn how to talk to them. And what I found is every little bit I found about the voices. You know, if they sensed that I thought those voices were hallucinations, they would shut up. They wouldn't tell me anything. You know, they would just clam up. But if I kind of kept an open mind and gave them the benefit of the doubt, even though I didn't know what they were, and then I would tell them what I knew about them, they would start to open up, and bit by bit by bit, they would tell me how they operated and what they did and what they were saying.
Yeah, and the funny thing is last time you shared that there was a consensus, you know, within the prison population on what these voices were saying, you know. And one of them, you know, just to break it down to the audience, if you didn't see the last one, that you learned that these voices got angry with you and said, hey, you have no right to interfere with our way of life, right?
Well, that's the one. That's the one where my denial system completely fell apart.
Yeah.
You know, for 7 years at the state hospital and probably another 6 working at the state prison, before I ever came to that conclusion. It was like staring me in the face, but I did not want to see it. I did not want to admit it. And every time the psychiatrist found out I was asking patients about their hallucinations, I was ordered to stop.
Of course, yeah.
You're upsetting my patients. These are hallucinations. They don't want to talk about them. You're making them worse. You know? And it's like, They never investigated these things. They don't know what they are. They don't know how they operate. What they would do is if the patient told them, hey, the voices are telling me to kill myself, they'd drug them up and lock them up in a padded cell and leave them there until they weren't suicidal anymore. So patients learned not to tell them that they were suicidal or their voices were telling them to kill themselves. Mm-hmm. So 4 out of 10 of them did kill themselves.
Right.
What was interesting, is that the suicide rate for psychiatrists is exactly the same.